Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? She stood near the back, hands folded, uniform too plain to draw attention. Dust clung to her boots and the desert light bleeding through the tent flap cut across her face, half shadow, half sun. Around her, men talked over radio codes and mission routes, maps spread out like open wounds. She listened quietly. No one asked for her input. No one even asked her name. They just called her Tent Girl. To them, she was the one who handed out bandages, checked pulse rates, fetched water, and cleaned blood off stretchers. The med-tent assistant, the one who didn't belong at the front lines. But that day, the lines between front and back were about to disappear. The colonel's voice cut through the murmurs. Operation Iron Sweep launches at 400. We move fast, silent, and we come home together. Together, the word echoed like a promise no one could keep. She stood there clutching her notebook, the one no one had ever seen her open. It was filled with diagrams, vitals, handwritten notes about every soldier in the unit, who smoked too much, who carried old shrapnel in their side, who flinched when thunder rolled because it sounded too much like artillery. She knew them all better than they knew her. But they didn't know the truth. Not about her training, not about the letter in her pocket, sealed and signed with an insignia that outranked most of the room. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this base, not under this identity. Yet when the colonel's eyes briefly passed over her, she felt something shift, not recognition, but a faint pause, like he was trying to place where he'd seen that face before. Then he turned away, and the moment vanished. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of oil and dust. Convoys lined up under a bleeding sky. Engines rumbled like distant thunder. She stepped out, the notebook still pressed to her chest, and watched as soldiers joked, smoked, checked weapons. The kind of laughter that only comes before danger, the sound of pretending not to be afraid. She wasn't laughing. A medic knows how fragile a heartbeat really is. One wrong step, 1 second too slow, and that sound of laughter could vanish forever. She took a long breath, steadying her thoughts. Her pulse was fast, but her hands were calm, always calm. That was her rule: if the hands shake, the mind breaks. She had learned that in a field hospital 3 years ago, when the earth itself trembled, and she'd been ordered to choose who lived and who didn't. No one saw her cry then either. And they wouldn't today. A corporal passed her with a half-smile. "Hey, tent girl, don't wander too far. We'll need you to patch us up when the real work starts." She nodded, pretending not to care, but his words left a small bruise somewhere inside. She didn't patch people up, she rebuilt them. The colonel's convoy rolled first. Then came the armored transports. Dust swallowed the horizon as the camp emptied. She stood at the edge of the airfield, eyes locked on the direction they vanished. Something in her gut twisted, not fear, but that quiet premonition every medic knows before chaos. She checked her watch. 04:17. The operation had begun. And yet radio silence. Minutes crawled into an hour, then 2. The base went unnervingly quiet. The sky turned white with heat. She was refilling saline packs when the first call came through, faint, broken, filled with static. "Under fire, need evac. Repeat, heavy casualties." She froze. The voice was familiar: Corporal Dean, the same one who joked with her that morning. "Where's your location?" the comms officer shouted. No answer. The colonel's call sign came next, sharp, clipped. "This is Iron One. We're pinned. Ambush on approach. Request med support immediately." Her heart clenched. The colonel never used the word request. Without waiting for orders, she grabbed her kit. Adrenaline flushed the hesitation out of her veins. Someone yelled after her, but she didn't hear it. She wasn't supposed to leave the tent. But when your people are bleeding, rules become noise. She ran. The vehicle roared through the desert, every bump slamming her into the seat. The driver, a young recruit with terrified eyes, kept glancing at her. "You sure about this, ma'am? That zone's still hot." She didn't look up from the map. "Just drive." The smell of gunpowder grew stronger as they neared the coordinates. Smoke columns clawed at the sky. Bodies lay where the sand had turned black. She forced herself not to look too long. Focus on the living. Always the living. When they stopped, the silence was deafening. Then came the sound, muffled groans, crackling fire, metal popping as it cooled. She jumped out, boots sinking in the soft sand. Her eyes swept the field, soldiers crawling, shouting, holding their limbs, blood soaking into their uniforms. And then she saw him, the colonel, half covered in dust, pressing his hand against a wound in his shoulder. He looked up, confusion cutting through the pain. What the hell are you doing here?" "Saving your unit," she said, dropping beside him. Her tone was calm, surgical. His eyes narrowed. "You're just—" "Not anymore." She tore his sleeve open and started working. Her movements were precise, clinical, tourniquet, pressure, morphine. The colonel stared as she pulled tools no field assistant should have out of her kit. "You're not supposed to have that." "I'm not supposed to be a lot of things," she murmured. He winced but kept watching. All around them, chaos unfolded, gunfire in the distance, radios screaming. She barked orders like a battlefield surgeon. "You hold pressure here. You get me the med crate from the truck. Move." And for the first time, they obeyed her. Because in moments like this, authority doesn't wear rank, it bleeds competence. Hours passed. She worked until her hands were slick with blood and dust. Every time she moved to the next body, she whispered a quiet word under her breath, sometimes a name, sometimes just "hold on." But then there was a sound, a soft, wet cough. She turned. Dean. A jagged piece of shrapnel had buried deep into his side. He was pale, lips blue. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Hey," she said softly, "you still owe me a coffee." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a choke. "Guess I didn't think Tent Girl could drive." "Guess you didn't know a lot of things," she whispered. Her hands moved fast. She'd done this procedure before, but never in a field this unstable. Gunfire echoed closer. The medic truck was already full. She pressed gauze into the wound, sealing what she could. But she knew the color of dying too well. He looked at her, eyes glassy. "Were you always one of us?" She hesitated, just a heartbeat too long. "Does it matter?" He smiled faintly. "Not anymore." When the breath left him, it was soft, like dust settling. She didn't cry. She just pressed her forehead to his for one silent second, then moved on. Because others still lived. The colonel's voice broke through the static again. "Tent Girl, report." She grabbed the radio. "You're stable. I've got 6 survivors ready for evac." There was a pause, then his tone changed, low, firm. "You saved the unit." She blinked, the words didn't make sense. "What?" "I said you saved the unit, soldier." And suddenly the air went still. The men around her stopped moving for a second, looked at her differently. She didn't answer, just stared at the ground where Dean's body lay beneath a tarp. She didn't feel like a savior, just a human who couldn't walk away. Hours later, back at base, the med tent glowed under flickering lights. She sat alone, wiping dried blood from her hands. The same soldiers who had ignored her before now passed by and nodded quietly. No one called her Tent Girl. Not anymore. The colonel entered without warning, arm bandaged, uniform torn. He stopped in front of her, silent. Then placed something on the table, a small silver pin. "Official recognition," he said. "You were never supposed to be here, and yet, if you hadn't been." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. She looked at the pin, then at him. "Will they remember their names?" He frowned. "Whose?" "The ones who didn't make it." He sighed. "We'll make sure of it." She stood, pocketed the pin, and walked out. The desert wind hit her face, hot, sharp, alive. Above her, the stars looked cold and endless. She whispered almost to herself, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." And for the first time since arriving at the base, she allowed herself to feel it, not pride, not sorrow, but something between. Peace, perhaps, or the quiet knowledge that someone, somewhere, would carry on because she did what had to be done. Why was her name missing from the report? The after-action summary listed every casualty, every injury, every commendation. But where her name should have been, there was nothing. Just a blank space like she'd never existed. She stared at the page, the hum of the generator filling the silence. Around her, the med tent was quiet again. Empty cots lined up in rows, stained with ghosts of blood that wouldn't wash out. The colonel had said she saved the unit, but no paperwork said it happened. Maybe that was the point. She closed the file and leaned back, exhaustion sinking through her bones. Outside, the base had returned to routine: drills, repairs, supply checks, the ritual of pretending nothing had happened. But the whispers hadn't stopped. Who is she really? She knew procedures no field nurse should know. She was using military-grade kits. She heard it all, didn't respond, let them wonder. Because she'd learned something long ago: silence protects more than truth ever can. Later that night, the colonel summoned her. His office was dim, lit by one flickering lamp and a map littered with new red markers. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," he said. She obeyed. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of paper rustling was the only thing alive in the room. Then he said quietly, "I requested your personnel file." She waited. It came back classified. He looked up finally, eyes sharp. That's unusual for a field medic, even more unusual for someone assigned under civilian auxiliary. She didn't answer. He leaned forward. "Who sent you here?" She could have lied, could have told him she was just a volunteer, misplaced by bureaucracy. But his gaze didn't allow that. So she said the only thing that felt true. "Someone who believed I could make a difference." He studied her. "You talk like a soldier." "I've seen soldiers," she replied. "Doesn't mean I am one." He almost smiled. "You're something, though, and right now this base could use more of whatever that is." She said nothing. He handed her a sealed envelope. "Orders came through this morning. You're being transferred." Her pulse tightened. "To where?" "Forward post, Zone Echo." Her stomach sank. Zone Echo wasn't a post, it was a graveyard, a line between chaos and civilization. Few came back. He noticed her hesitation. "You don't have to go," he said. "You've already done more than enough." But that wasn't true. The moment she'd stepped into the med tent weeks ago, she'd known she wasn't here by chance. There was something she was meant to do. She took the envelope. "When do I leave?" "Dawn." He nodded once, a quiet respect in his eyes. "If anyone asks, tell them the colonel personally assigned you." As she stood to go, he added, "Whatever your past is, don't let it chain you. We all bleed the same here." She didn't look back. The desert night was cold. She walked past the sleeping barracks, the trucks parked in rows like silent sentries. Every step felt heavier, pulled down by the weight of memories she hadn't let herself face. She stopped at the edge of the camp. The stars stretched endless, indifferent. In her pocket, the notebook she always carried pressed against her palm. She opened it under the starlight: sketches of organs, blood flow diagrams, chemical notations. But on the last page, hidden beneath folded paper, was a single name: Elias Ward. The name no one knew, the name she'd been running from. She touched it with her thumb, tracing the faded ink. He'd been the first soldier she couldn't save, the one who'd taught her that not every wound heals, not even with time. She closed the notebook. Tomorrow would come too soon. At dawn, the convoy to Zone Echo rolled out, 6 trucks, 1 armored ambulance in her. The road was nothing but dirt and silence. Hours passed under a merciless sun. Occasionally, she'd see the faint glint of old shell casings half buried in the sand, remnants of battles long forgotten. The sergeant sitting opposite her tried making conversation. "They say you saved the colonel himself," he said, grinning. "That true?" She shrugged. "He saved himself, I just stopped the bleeding." He laughed. "Humility. Haven't heard much of that lately." She didn't smile. "It's not humility, it's memory." He frowned, unsure what she meant, then turned to look out the window. When the first explosion hit, it came without warning. The world flipped. Metal screamed. Dust and fire swallowed the air. She hit the ground hard, ears ringing, vision shaking. For a second, everything slowed, floating debris, drifting sand, her own heartbeat slamming in her skull. Then the screaming began. She forced herself up, coughing, clutching her kit. The convoy was gone, or what was left of it. One truck overturned, another in flames. She moved before fear could think. "Anyone alive?" she shouted, voice hoarse. A faint moan answered. She followed it, crawling, bleeding, ignoring the sting of shrapnel on her cheek. Found a young soldier pinned under wreckage, leg twisted at a wrong angle. "Don't move," she said, dropping beside him. He stared at her wide-eyed. "They said we were clear." "I know," her tone was steady. "You're going to be okay." It was a lie. She needed to believe herself. The wreck groaned above them, metal giving way. She jammed a bar into the sand, using all her strength to shift the debris. He screamed. She didn't stop. Finally, the weight slid off. She dragged him clear, lungs burning. Gunfire echoed from somewhere beyond the ridge, short, disciplined bursts. Not random, not bandits. Someone knew they were coming. Hours blurred. She worked without pause, tourniquets, bandages, field drips, at least 3 men still breathing. By sunset, the echoes of combat faded. Silence returned. She sat in the sand, hands trembling for the first time in years. The smell of diesel and blood filled the air. That's when she heard it, faint footsteps behind her. She turned sharply, reaching instinctively for the pistol on her belt. A figure emerged from the haze, dust-covered, weapon slung over one shoulder, uniform half torn. Not enemy. Not ally. Something in between. The figure raised both hands slowly. "Easy. I'm not here to fight." "Identify yourself," she demanded. He stepped closer. His voice was calm, tired. "Name's Ward, Lieutenant Elias Ward." Her breath caught. The notebook in her pocket burned against her skin. That name. It wasn't possible. He stopped a few meters away, watching her reaction. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She couldn't speak. Her throat was dry, words jammed behind disbelief. He smiled faintly. "You thought I was dead, didn't you?" "You were dead. Apparently not well enough." The wind picked up, whipping sand between them. He crouched near the wounded soldier, checking the bandages she'd made. "Good work," he said softly. "You kept them alive." She stared at him. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," he replied. For a moment, the years between them collapsed, replaced by the memory of a field hospital, the same sand, the same night, the same helplessness. Back then, she'd watched him bleed out on a stretcher, watched his heartbeat fade, watched the monitors die. She'd written his name down herself. Now here he was alive, and he wasn't smiling anymore. "You were reassigned after that mission," he said, "buried under a new name. Why?" She looked away. "Because someone decided I was easier to protect than to explain." He nodded slowly. "They sent you here for a reason. You know that, right?" "I don't want to know why." "But you already do." He leaned in. "The attack today wasn't random. It was a clean hit. They knew exactly which convoy you were on. You were the target." Her pulse froze. "Who?" she whispered. He shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to find out." Night fell heavy. They built a small fire near the wrecks. The surviving soldiers slept in silence, exhausted beyond words. She sat across from him, watching the flames dance. He looked older, thinner, more haunted, but still carried that same steadiness that used to calm entire rooms. "I tried to save you," she said quietly. "I know. You died on my table." "I almost did," he smiled weakly. "Guess I wasn't done yet." She didn't laugh. "You should have stayed dead." "Maybe, but if I had, you'd be out here alone." She met his eyes. "I am alone." He nodded, accepting that truth. Then said softly, "You've changed." "So have you." For a while neither spoke. The fire cracked softly between them, small and stubborn against the desert night. He finally broke the silence. "You still write names." She hesitated. "Only the ones I can't forget." "Then write mine again," he said, "because this time I'm not going anywhere." Far in the distance, a flare went up red against black, a signal. He saw it first. "They're coming." "Who?" "Whoever hit us." He rose, checking his rifle. "We can't stay here. We'll move east to the canyon ridge. Radio signal's stronger there." She gathered her kit. "The wounded can't walk." "Then we carry them." They moved under the stars, two silhouettes dragging stretchers through sand that glowed faintly under moonlight. No one spoke, no one complained. But in the back of her mind, one question burned. If Elia's ward was alive, then what else had been hidden from her? And why was she still being treated like a ghost that wasn't supposed to exist? That night, as they reached the ridge, she glanced back at the desert smoke still rising from the destroyed convoy. Somewhere beneath that ruin, a truth was buried, one she wasn't ready to face. But she could feel it now. The storm wasn't over. It was only waiting. Why was the night so quiet? Too quiet for a war zone, too quiet for survival. The kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes you wonder if the world is holding its breath or waiting for yours to stop. She adjusted the strap on her pack, boots crunching over gravel as she followed Ward up the slope. The wounded men they'd carried lay behind them, hidden in a shallow trench with what little supplies they had left. They needed extraction, but command hadn't answered the radio in hours. Maybe no one was left to answer. "Keep low," Ward whispered. "Thermal drones sweep this ridge every hour." She nodded, crouching beside him. The moon cast a pale glow across the rocks, silvering the scars in his face. He looked like a ghost carved out of discipline and memory. "How long have they been tracking us?" she asked quietly. "Since before the convoy left base," he said. "You were marked before you even knew it." "By who?" "Whoever wants you gone." He said it so simply, it almost sounded merciful. But nothing about this was mercy. They reached the ridge's peak. From up here, the desert stretched endless, dunes like waves frozen in time, the wreckage of the convoy a faint scar far behind them. Smoke still bled into the horizon. Ward crouched and pointed east. "There's an old communications outpost about 5 clicks that way. If it's still standing, we can reach command." "And if it's not?" He gave a dry smile. "Then we keep walking until one of us collapses." She didn't answer. Her mind was somewhere else, on the colonel, on the men she'd saved, on the blank line in the report where her name should have been. She'd accepted silence as her armor, anonymity as her shield. But now, both were being used against her. Whoever erased her from the records didn't just want her forgotten. They wanted her erased. Dawn crept in slow. By the time they reached the outpost, the heat was rising, shimmering in waves that made the ground look like it was breathing. The building was a ruin, a concrete box half buried in sand, windows shattered, antenna bent. Ward went first, rifle raised. She followed, scanning the shadows. Inside, the air smelled of rust and abandonment. Old bullet holes pocked the walls. A radio console sat in the corner, half covered by a torn tarp. Ward wiped dust off the panel. Might still work if we can get power. She found the generator room. The old fuel cans were bone dry, but there was a manual crank. It would take time, strength. "I'll do it," she said. He started to protest, but she was already turning the lever, muscles burning. Slowly, the old machine coughed to life, sputtering like an old man remembering how to breathe. Lights flickered, the radio clicked. Ward adjusted frequencies, static roaring, then fatting. He leaned close to the mic. "This is Lieutenant Elias Ward, forward convoy Echo, requesting immediate evac at grid 2207. We have survivors. Repeat, survivors." Silence. He tried again. Then faintly, a voice. "Ward, copy that, you." His eyes widened. "Colonel." The voice came clearer. "We thought you were gone." "Not yet," Ward said. "We're at the old outpost, but we were ambushed. Someone leaked our route." A pause, then low. "Understood, hold position, extraction in 2 hours." Ward exhaled slowly, relief flickering for the first time in days. "We made it." But she wasn't smiling. Something about the transmission bothered her, not the voice, but the tone. Too flat, too rehearsed. The colonel never sounded like that. And when she leaned toward the console, she noticed something small blinking beneath the desk, a red diode, pulsing faintly. Her stomach dropped. "Ward," she whispered, "we need to move." He frowned. "What?" "This place is bugged." The explosion hit before she finished the word. The roof tore open. The blast threw them both against the wall. Dust, metal, heat, the world became noise. When she opened her eyes, her ears were ringing, blood on her face. Ward was dragging her across the floor. Flames licked the corners of the room. "They tracked the signal," he shouted over the roar. It was command. She staggered to her feet, pain stabbing through her side. "We have to get the wounded." "They're gone," he said, voice cracking. "The trench took the first hit." Her throat tightened. "No." He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You can't save the dead." For a moment she hated him for saying it. Then the medic in her took over. Logic over grief. Movement over paralysis. "Then we get out," she said. They ran through the collapsing hallway, bursting into open air as the outpost crumbled behind them. For miles, there was nothing but fire and sand. They didn't stop running until their lungs burned. When they finally collapsed behind a dune, Ward ripped open his sleeve, blood soaking through the fabric. She pressed a bandage against the wound, hands shaking. He winced. "You're bleeding too." "I'll manage." He smirked weakly. "You always say that." She looked up sharply. "Always." He froze. "I mean, I've heard stories." But she saw it, that flicker in his eyes. Recognition. "Ward," she said slowly, "how long have you known who I am?" He hesitated. "Since the convoy, I saw the name on the manifest. You were supposed to be dead, too." Her jaw tightened. "And you didn't tell me." "I needed to see if you were still the same person." She laughed bitterly. "And what am I now?" His gaze softened. "Someone who keeps saving people who can't save themselves." For a moment, silence again. The wind howled across the sand like a voice trying to speak. Then she said quietly, "You should have let me die with the others." He didn't reply. Because he knew she wasn't speaking out of despair, but guilt. The kind that eats at you long after the wound's close. By nightfall, the temperature dropped fast. They built another small fire from scraps. The flames reflected in her eyes, restless and haunted. Ward sat across from her, wrapping his arm. "When did you stop believing in what we were doing?" She didn't answer right away. "After the hospital raid," she said finally. "They told us it was a rescue op. It was." "What happened?" "They bombed it, civilians, staff, all gone. We were ordered to leave them." Her voice trembled, the first crack since he'd met her again. "I stayed behind, pulled out who I could. That's why they erased me." He stared at her. "You disobeyed command." "I disobeyed inhumanity." The words hung between them, heavy and raw. Ward looked down. "That's why they sent you here, not as punishment, as cover. They needed you hidden." She met his gaze. "And now they're cleaning up the mess." He nodded grimly. "By finishing what they started." A distant hum rose on the wind, faint, rhythmic, growing louder. "Helicopters." "But not from base." Ward's expression hardened. "They're sweeping the area, looking for survivors." "Or witnesses," she said. He checked his rifle. "If we move north, there's a canyon system. We can lose them there." She looked at him, tired, bleeding, still commanding calm in chaos. "Why are you helping me, Elias?" He hesitated. "Because once you tried to save me, and I need to know why." She smiled sadly. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me." She looked into the fire, voice low. "Because when the world stops caring about life, someone has to remember what it means." He didn't respond, but the look on his face said everything. Maybe he finally understood. They moved again before dawn, the desert stretching before them like an endless test. She carried the med pack over one shoulder, the weight digging into her spine, but she didn't complain. The sun rose harsh, merciless. Sweat stung her wounds, dust clung to her lips, but every step she took was measured, controlled. She walked away from commands, ranks, recognition. But this survival was something purer. Ward walked ahead, scanning the horizon. "Once we reach the canyon, we can follow it to the border." "And after that?" "After that," he said, "you decide what kind of ghost you want to be." By midday, the canyon walls rose around them, tall, red cliffs carved by centuries of wind. Cool shade replaced heat. The sound of distant water echoed faintly. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful. Then a sharp click under her boot. She froze. Ward turned instantly. "Don't move." She didn't breathe. He knelt, brushed away the sand, a pressure plate, old, corroded, but still armed. His jaw tightened. "Booby-trapped root." "How bad?" "Bad enough." She swallowed. "Can you disarm it?" "Maybe, but if it's wired to chain detonators." He stopped, met her eyes. She understood. "Go," she said. "Not leaving you." "Elias." "Not again." She wanted to argue, to shout, but something in his voice silenced her. He worked fast, hands steady despite the sweat. The ticking filled the air, faint but constant, like the heartbeat of fate itself. Then a spark. He jerked back. "Run." The blast tore through the canyon, dust exploding upward, echoing for miles. She hit the ground hard, world spinning, ears ringing. When she turned, Ward was gone. Just a crater, smoke, and silence. She crawled toward the edge, coughing, calling his name. Nothing, only echoes. Her hands shook as she searched the rubble, debris, shattered rock, blood on the stones. Her heart clenched, the same way it had the night she'd written his name the first time. She whispered it again, voice breaking. "Elias." But the canyon stayed silent. And for the first time since she'd arrived in this war, she felt it, the emptiness of saving everyone except yourself. She sat there until the sun began to set, the light turning the rocks gold. Her uniform was torn, her skin streaked with dust and blood. From the horizon, another flare rose, white this time. Search teams. But she didn't move. She just whispered, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." Then quietly, she picked up her kit and started walking, not toward the flare, not toward rescue, but deeper into the canyon, where no one would ever think to look. Because some people don't need medals or recognition. They just need to finish what they started. And somewhere in that burning desert, the girl they once called Tent Girl became something else entirely. A ghost, a savior, and a secret the world would never quite understand. The sun hadn't risen yet when the first mortar struck. The ground convulsed beneath her boots, throwing dust and screams into the air. She was outside the triage tent, still wrapping a soldier's arm when the second blast hit closer, too close. The shockwave punched her chest, her breath caught midair, and for a heartbeat she thought she'd gone deaf. Then came the shouting, orders, chaos. Someone ran past yelling, "Medic down, we've got a man hit." Her ears rang, her heart didn't, she moved. She grabbed her kit, stumbled through the dust cloud, past the overturned tables and blood-splattered tarps. Her mind locked into rhythm, pressure, airway, pulse. Every sound faded but the heartbeat of duty. When she found the man, his chest was open, breath bubbling red. Two soldiers knelt beside him, frozen. "Do something," one cried. She dropped to her knees. "Get me gauze, pressure bandage now." Her voice was calm. It didn't belong to the girl who once hid in a corner during briefings. It was the voice of someone who decided fear was a luxury. Her hands worked faster than her thoughts. She packed the wound, sealed it, whispered to him, "Stay with me, just stay." He couldn't. His eyes rolled back, breath faltered. For a moment, time slowed. She felt the pulse fade beneath her fingers. Then she kept working, because that's what medics do. By the time she realized, she was bleeding herself. A shard had grazed her side. She had already stabilized 3 others and cleared space for stretchers. When the shelling stopped, the silence was unbearable. The camp looked unrecognizable, torn canvas, smoke, shrapnel buried in the dirt like teeth. She stood alone among the wounded. That's when the colonel arrived, covered in dust, eyes cold but steady. He scanned the destruction, then stopped on her. He'd never noticed her before, not really. She'd always been the quiet one, the girl who carried supplies, cleaned scalpels, disappeared when officers spoke. But now she stood in the ruins, hands soaked crimson, breathing like a storm. He said nothing at first, just watched her move, organizing, commanding, triaging without a pause. Then he called out, voice rough, "You medic, what's your name?" She froze. No one had asked that before, not in weeks. "Lena, sir." "Lena," he nodded slowly, almost in disbelief. "You saved this unit." The words barely registered. They felt foreign, like a language she hadn't heard since childhood. Saved? She wanted to laugh, to scream, to tell him she couldn't save them all, that she'd failed the man on the ground, that her hands were shaking, her soul cracking. But instead she said, "We lost Corporal Hayes." "I know," he replied quietly, "but because of you we didn't lose everyone else." The weight of that truth landed softly and shattered her inside. That night, when the fires burned low and the moans of the injured turned into whispers, she sat by herself behind the tent. Her hands still smelled of iron. She thought about Hayes, about the others she couldn't reach, about home. And she realized she hadn't cried in days, maybe weeks. A quiet voice inside asked her, "When did you stop feeling?" She didn't know. Across the camp, the colonel stood in the glow of a lantern, watching her from afar. He saw the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she hugged her knees, and he said to the sergeant beside him, "Make sure she gets rest. That's an order." But the sergeant shook his head. "She won't, sir. She hasn't since we lost Bravo team." The colonel's eyes softened. "Then she's stronger than most of us." When Lena finally closed her eyes, she dreamt of silence. No explosions, no orders, no pain, just wind moving through a field of grass. But even in dreams, she heard the heartbeat she couldn't save. And when she woke up, it was still there, faint, like a ghost's whisper, reminding her that survival wasn't victory. It was debt. She got up before dawn, wrapped her wound, and went back to work. Because that's what people like her did, not for medals, not for recognition, but because someone had to keep others alive long enough to go home. And if no one remembered her name, that was fine. The one she saved would carry it anyway, in the quiet moments between life and loss. She didn't know it then, but that day would echo through every soldier who lived because of her hands. They would tell stories about a girl in a torn uniform, working through smoke, refusing to stop. And somewhere in a headquarters far away, a report would cross a desk. Unidentified female medic provided emergency triage under fire, prevented total unit loss. No medals, no signature, just words on a page. But among soldiers, that was enough. Because they remembered. And that night, when Lena washed the blood from her hands and looked at her reflection in the tin basin, she finally saw what no one else had noticed. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the quiet pulse that kept them alive. And sometimes that's what saving the world looks like. Not in glory, not in headlines. Just one steady heartbeat at a time. The rain came 3 days after the bombardment. Soft at first, a whisper against the shredded tents and scorched ground. Then heavier, washing away the dust, the ash, the smell of gunpowder that had seeped into everything. Lena stood under the edge of the medical canopy, watching the dirt turn to mud. The raindrops traced paths through the blood stains on her hands she still couldn't scrub clean. The camp was quieter now, too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed on your chest and made you remember things you didn't want to. She spent the last 72 hours treating infection, checking vitals, and convincing men twice her size to hold on just one more day. Some did, some didn't. And when she finally stopped, when her hands finally stilled, the silence hit her harder than any explosion. She could hear her own breathing. She hated it. It meant she was still here when so many weren't. A voice broke the stillness. "Rain, a good sign," the colonel said, stepping beside her. His uniform was still torn, his face shadowed by exhaustion. "Means the skis are done punishing us for a while." Lena didn't answer. She just kept watching the rain. He glanced at her, the girl everyone had once overlooked. "I read your field reports. You didn't mention yourself once." She shook her head slightly. "It's not about me." "That's exactly why I'm worried." The words hung there between them, carried by the sound of rain hitting canvas. He finally said, quieter, "We're pulling out tomorrow. Reinforcements are taking over. You'll be rotating back to base hospital." She didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't ask where the others were going. Just said there are still infections, burns that'll take weeks to close. They need continuity. "They'll get it," he said, "but you need rest." Her eyes, dark with fatigue, met his. "Rest doesn't bring them back." He exhaled, that slow, heavy sigh that only commanders make after too many names on casualty lists. "No, it doesn't, but it keeps you from joining them." She looked away again. The rain blurred her vision, and for a moment she pretended it was the weather, not the tears she'd forgotten how to shed. That night, as the others slept, she sat by the field table writing. Not reports, not requisitions, just names. Every soldier who'd passed through her hands, the ones who'd lived, the ones who hadn't. She didn't know why she wrote them. Maybe because if she didn't, they'd disappear like smoke. Halfway through, her pen stopped on one name, Hayes. She stared at the letters until they blurred. He had a wife, a daughter maybe. He once shown her a photo, she remembered that now. She wondered who would tell them what really happened, who would tell them how he fought to stay alive, how he said his daughter's name with his last breath. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket, not for the file, for herself. Morning came gray and cold. The unit gathered for extraction. Engines hummed low as trucks lined up, soldiers loading supplies, bandaged men leaning on each other. Lena stood by the tent, her pack small, her gaze distant. The colonel approached her again, holding something, a simple patch, faded from use. "This belonged to Hayes," he said quietly. "He would have wanted you to have it." She hesitated. "Sir, I can't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "He said if he didn't make it, give it to the one who stayed." The words hit like a slow knife. She reached out, took the patch and closed her hand around it. The colonel watched her for a long moment. "You remind me of someone I used to know, a medic, Vietnam." He paused. "Never got a medal either, but every man who made it home knew her name." Lena didn't answer. She didn't need to. On the ride back, she sat by the window of the transport, the landscape rolling by, endless fields of red dust and ruined villages. She thought of the ones who never got rides back. Her reflection looked like someone else's, older, wearier, harder. When the convoy stopped at the forward base, a young private climbed aboard. His uniform was clean, too clean. He looked at her with quiet awe. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "are you the medic from the ridge?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Who told you that?" "Everyone, ma'am. They said you saved half the unit, they said." He hesitated. "They said you didn't even stop when the tent caught fire." She didn't know what to say. There was no version of those words that felt real. So she just replied softly, "Stories grow faster than people heal." He smiled nervously, nodded, and moved on. When he was gone, she finally exhaled. Maybe, she thought, silence wasn't about being unseen anymore. Maybe it was how you carried the weight without breaking. That evening she walked alone to the perimeter fence. The wind was warm, the horizon bruised by sunset. In her hand she held the patch, Hayes's patch, running her thumb across the frayed edges. She closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe without counting the seconds. Somewhere behind her, someone called her name, a voice she didn't recognize. Maybe another soldier, maybe a medic asking for supplies. But for that one brief moment, she didn't turn around. She just stood there in the fading light, between what was lost and what was left, and let the silence be what it was. Peaceful. Not victory, not pride, just peace, fragile and temporary but real enough to hold. Later, as she returned to the camp, she overheard two soldiers talking near the trucks. "That girl," one said, nodding toward her, "you know she's the reason any of us got out of there." The other shrugged. "Funny thing, I thought she was just a tent nurse." The first soldier looked back at her, lowering his voice. "Guess we all did." Lena didn't stop walking, she didn't turn. But there was the smallest flicker at the corner of her mouth, not a smile exactly, something quieter, something truer. Because maybe that was enough. Not recognition, not medals, just knowing she'd done what needed to be done and that someone somewhere finally saw it. And as the wind carried the sound of the rain still falling far away, she thought of a truth she'd carry for the rest of her life. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. It whispers. It binds wounds no one else can see. It stays behind when others run. The air at base hospital smelled different. Clean, too clean, like antiseptic and stillness pretending to be peace. Lena stood in the corridor, bag slung over her shoulder, watching the orderly wheel a stretcher past. The soldier on it was young, too young. His eyes darted around the white walls as if they were closing in on him. She recognized that look. She'd seen it in the mirror. "Room 3B, a nurse called out, checking a clipboard. "New intake from Ridge Sector. They said you were there." Lena nodded slowly. Her throat felt dry. "Yeah, I was there." "Then you'll know what to expect," the nurse said quietly. "He's one of the lucky ones." Lena wanted to say there were no lucky ones, not really, only survivors with different kinds of scars. But she didn't. She just followed the stretcher into the ward. Inside, the hum of machines filled the silence. IV drips, heart monitors, the rhythm of life continuing because someone refused to let it stop. She slipped her gloves on automatically. The motions burned into her muscle memory. Pressure, clean, inject, bandage, move on. But this time there was nowhere to move on to. No perimeter, no shelling, no command tent waiting for casualties. Just quiet. And the quiet was the worst of it. Because in the quiet, her mind started to replay what her hands had done. She saw Hayes again, the moment his pulse faded, the colonel's voice telling her she'd saved the unit, the disbelief that came with it. She shook it off, forced herself to focus. "Let's get him stabilized," she told the nurse beside her. Her tone was steady, professional, detached. The way soldiers are when feeling becomes too heavy to carry. That night she didn't go to the barracks. She stayed in the small supply room, sitting on the floor between boxes of gauze and saline. In her pocket the patch still rested, Hayes's patch. She turned it over in her hands again and again, tracing the frayed edges. Someone knocked on the door. "Ma'am." It was a voice she didn't recognize. "You're the one from Ridge, right?" She didn't answer right away. "Who's asking?" The door opened slowly. A young man stepped in, same private from the transport convoy. His arm was in a sling now. He smiled awkwardly. "They told me you were here. Thought I'd say thank you." She looked up, blinking. "For what?" "For pulling me out when the tent collapsed," he said simply. "You probably don't remember. I was the one yelling about my leg." Her memory flickered, flashes of firelight, smoke, someone screaming. She hadn't even known his name. "I just wanted you to know," he continued. "My brother said, when you're scared, look for someone calm. I saw you that night and you were calm. That's why I stopped panicking." He laughed quietly, almost embarrassed. "I figured you should know you made a difference." Lena didn't move, didn't know what to do with those words. After a pause, she said, "You made it out, that's what matters." He nodded. "Yeah, but not everyone did. My buddy didn't." She looked down again. "I know." He hesitated. "You ever think about them?" She smiled faintly, but it wasn't joy. "Every night." He swallowed. "Does it ever get easier?" She thought about that for a long moment. "No, but you learn to carry it better." The private nodded, not fully understanding, but somehow grateful anyway. He left her there with the sound of the rain outside tapping against the window. And for the first time since the Ridge, Lena allowed herself to lean back and close her eyes, not to sleep, but to simply exist. Weeks passed. Her hands healed. The cut on her side faded to a thin scar, but her mind, that stayed raw. Every patient she touched became a reflection of someone she'd lost. Every pulse she checked became a question. What if this one stops too? The colonel visited once, just once. He stood at the foot of the hospital bed, where a wounded lieutenant lay. "You look better," he said to her. She forced a small nod. "Appearances, sir." He half smiled. "Command asking for you. We've got a humanitarian mission, border evacuation. Civilians, not soldiers." Her brows furrowed. "You're sending me back out." He hesitated. "No one's sending you, I'm asking." She looked down at her hands. They trembled just slightly, only she noticed. "I thought I'd have more time," she whispered. He nodded once. "You'll never have enough, none of us do." There was silence. Then he added, "You're not just a medic, Lena. You're a reason people keep believing we're still human." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was tight, her chest aching with 1,000 unspoken thoughts. When he left, she sat alone again. The words stayed, though, a reason people keep believing we're still human. What did that even mean, she wondered. Because sometimes she didn't feel human at all. The next morning she found herself packing anyway. Syringes, bandages, morphine, the essentials. No orders required. No applause expected. At the loading dock, a sergeant waved her over. "You sure about this, ma'am? Word is the region's unstable." Lena fastened her vest. So was the Ridge. He shook his head with a wry smile. "Guess you're one of those who doesn't know how to quit." She looked up at the gray dawn, the horizon waiting like a test she hadn't studied for. "Maybe," she said softly, "I just don't know how to stop showing up." As the truck rumbled forward, she glanced back at the base hospital. Through the rear window, it looked smaller and smaller, like a memory fading behind her. But deep down, she knew the truth. You don't leave places like that. They stay with you. Every scream, every face, every moment you almost broke but didn't. And as the road stretched into the unknown, Lena closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Just one more mission, then I'll rest." But she didn't believe it, because somewhere deep inside, she knew rest wasn't for people like her. It was for those she kept alive. And she would keep going, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't do anything else. Why did silence feel heavier than gunfire? The camp was quiet now, too quiet for her mind to rest. Night wrapped around the valley like a heavy blanket. The stars hung motionless, distant, and cold. She sat outside the tent, knees pulled close, a tin mug between her hands, staring at the horizon that still held the ghost of smoke. Every sound, the wind brushing canvas, the faint metallic creak of cooling vehicles, felt like it carried ghosts. It had been 12 hours since the attack. 12 hours since she'd walked out of the med tent with blood on her sleeves that wasn't her own. She still couldn't forget the look on Private Diaz's face, wide-eyed, barely 20, as he'd whispered, "Tell my mom I fought brave." He hadn't even known she wasn't a soldier like the others. To him, she was just someone who stayed beside him while the world fell apart. The colonel had said they'd saved the unit, but she didn't feel like a savior. She felt like someone who had survived by accident. A shadow moved beside her. It was Captain Reeves. He carried his own silence like armor. He sat next to her, no words at first. They both looked at the valley, the place where everything had burned. "Command says evac in 48 hours, he finally said, low voice, gravel, and fatigue. "They're sending a new unit to relieve us." She nodded without looking. He turned slightly. "You should get some rest, Doc." That word "Doc" hit something inside her. The first time he'd called her that, it had felt strange, like a costume she wasn't ready to wear. Now it carried weight, pain, respect. "I can't sleep," she said softly. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them." Reeves exhaled slowly. "Yeah, you don't stop seeing them, you just learn to live around it." She looked at him then, really looked, the dirt, the lines of exhaustion, the 1,000-yard stare that said he'd buried too many people already. He noticed her gaze and gave a faint, bitter smile. "You did good out there. You held that whole damn place together." She wanted to believe him, but her hands still trembled. Her voice barely held when she whispered, "I thought I was going to lose him. I thought I wasn't enough." Reeves didn't answer immediately. He took a long sip from his flask, then handed it to her. "None of us are ever enough, Harper, but somehow we keep trying. That's what makes us different." She hesitated, then took the flask. The liquid burned her throat, sharp and grounding. For a second the cold night faded, replaced by the warmth of shared silence. Then movement. A faint glint from the ridge across the valley, barely there. Her instincts sharpened instantly. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Reeves was already reaching for his rifle. "Yeah." They moved without words, crouching low to the ground, scanning. The thermal scope flickered. 2 signatures, maybe 3. "Scout?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, too close for that, they're observing." Her heart quickened. The base was still vulnerable, half the perimeter destroyed. If there were hostiles, they could hit before dawn. Reeves lowered his rifle. "Wake the colonel, quietly. Tell him we've got eyes in the hills." She didn't hesitate. Her boots barely made a sound as she moved across camp, through the thin fog that clung to the ground. The colonel's tent was still lit. The man never slept either. She entered, saluted instinctively. "Sir, possible movement on the east ridge. 2, maybe 3 hostiles." He didn't flinch, just set down his map and grabbed the radio. Within seconds, low commands spread like whispers through the dark. Men stirred, weapons loaded. Harper went back to her station, the med tent. The smell of antiseptic and burnt nylon hit her again. She hated it, but she couldn't leave. This was her battlefield. Reeves returned after 10 minutes. "They're gone," he said. "Slipped back into the hills, probably recon." Looking for weaknesses, she murmured. Yeah, he paused. They'll be back. There was nothing else to say. When dawn finally came, the mountains glowed gold, too beautiful for the ugliness beneath. Soldiers walked the perimeter. Drones hummed overhead. And Harper stitched another wound, cleaned another burn, patched another man who wouldn't stop thanking her even as he bled. She didn't realize how much the others had started to watch her differently. The girl they used to pass by, the one who handed out bandages and coffee, was now the one they looked for when things went bad. But she wasn't used to it. Every thank you, every you saved me, scraped against her guilt, because in her heart she kept seeing the one she couldn't save. That evening, a supply convoy arrived from the nearest forward base, 2 trucks, half the supplies promised, and a medic team she didn't recognize. The lead medic stepped out, confident, brisk, sterile. She looked around the wrecked camp, then at Harper's mud-streaked uniform. "You've been improvising?" the new medic asked. Harper nodded. "We ran out of everything on day 2. The woman frowned, flipping through a clipboard. "You're not even listed in our personnel files. Who exactly authorized you?" Before Harper could answer, a voice cut through the tent. "I did. The colonel." He stepped in, his presence filling the space like thunder. "She's the reason anyone here is still breathing. So unless you're here to learn something, get out of her way." The medic's expression shifted, respect mixed with discomfort. She gave a short nod, muttered something, and left. The colonel looked at Harper, his tone softening. "You've done more than anyone could ask. When we get back, you'll be put in for commendation." She shook her head. "I don't want medals, sir. I just want to go home." He studied her face, the exhaustion, the quiet fire. "Then that's what you'll do, but not yet. We still need you." That night she wrote in her field notebook, words no one would ever read. "They keep saying I saved them, but I think they saved me. If I hadn't been here, I would have never known what I could endure, what I could care for." But her hand trembled, because deep down she feared she was changing. The kindness that had brought her here was turning into something else, a hard shell, a numbness she didn't recognize. She set the notebook down. Outside, the wind carried the faint smell of ash and rain. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly. And for the first time since the ambush, she allowed herself to cry. Quiet tears. No sobbing, no noise. Just silent grief slipping down her dirt-streaked face, for the men she couldn't save, for the version of herself she'd lost, and for the strange, cruel beauty of this broken place that had somehow become her world. Because out here, under the endless sky, she'd learned the truth. You can save others again and again, but you'll never walk away untouched. And as she finally lay down, her head resting on the canvas floor, she whispered to the night, "Tomorrow I'll still be here." The mountains said nothing back, but they held her secret like they held every soldier's, quiet, eternal, unspoken. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with bullets. They're fought in the heart, one quiet night at a time. Why did leaving feel harder than surviving? The evac choppers arrived 3 days later, their blades carving through the morning air, lifting the dust and ash into a storm of gold and gray. Soldiers gathered in silence, gear slung over their backs, eyes hollow, uniforms stained with more than just dirt. For most, it was relief. For her, it was something else entirely. Harper stood by the wrecked med tent, the same one where everything had happened. The one she'd turned into a sanctuary, a battlefield, a confession booth for the dying. Now it was coming down. Men were folding the cots, sealing the crates. The smell of antiseptic and metal still clung to the air. She traced her fingers along the edge of a blood-stained table, feeling the grooves carved into it by chaos and mercy alike. Every mark was a memory, every scratch a story. Reeves approached, helmet under his arm. "You ready?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the table. "I don't think I'll ever be ready." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, understanding in his silence. "Command wants you back in the capital. There's talk of commendations, recognition, maybe even an officer's recommendation." She gave a faint, tired smile. "For doing my job. For saving a unit that shouldn't have made it out," he said quietly. But she shook her head. No one should get medals for surviving hell. He opened his mouth to reply, then stopped, because he saw something in her eyes that words couldn't touch, something deeper than exhaustion, a quiet ache that comes when a person's soul has seen too much. They both turned as the colonel approached, his uniform pressed but his eyes just as weary. "Doc Harper," he said, voice carrying the weight of command and gratitude alike. "You've done more for this unit than you'll ever know." "Sir, I—" He held up a hand. "Don't, just listen." The wind blew through the valley, whistling softly between the broken vehicles and burnt sandbags. "When the dust cleared after the first strike," the colonel continued, "I was told we had no medics left. I was told we'd have to hold out without medical support. But then I heard the radio crackle, and it was your voice." Harper's eyes flickered. She remembered that moment, the static, the fear, the shaking hands pressing gauze on open wounds. "You didn't wait for orders," he said. "You didn't ask for permission. You just acted. You saved 37 lives before reinforcements even arrived. And when everyone else thought it was over, you went back out there." She swallowed hard. "It wasn't bravery, sir. It was instinct." He smiled faintly. "Instinct like that is rare. The kind that puts others before yourself, that's not training, that's character." Her throat tightened. "With respect, sir, I didn't save all of them." "No one ever does," he said softly. "But you saved enough to make the rest of us remember what humanity looks like." For a long moment neither spoke, only the wind moved. Finally the colonel reached into his vest and pulled something out, a small, mud-streaked insignia. He placed it gently in her hand. "This belonged to Corporal Hayes. He asked me to give it to you, said you kept him alive long enough to see the sunrise. That was enough for him." Her fingers closed around it like it was made of glass. She blinked back tears, but they came anyway, slow, silent, unstoppable. The colonel nodded once, turned and walked away. Reeves stayed behind. He waited until she found her breath again. "They'll write about this," he said quietly, "about you." "Then they'll get it wrong," she whispered. "They always do." He smiled sadly. "Probably, but maybe some young recruit will read it and decide to care a little more. That's worth something." She looked up at him. "What about you?" He shrugged. "I go where they send me, that's the job." "Even after this?" He gave a wry grin. "Especially after this." A faint laugh escaped her, the first in weeks. But it faded quickly, replaced by that heavy silence again. When the call for departure came, she walked to the chopper, boots sinking into the dust that had once been home to fire and chaos. Every step felt final. Every sound, the whirring blades, the shouts, the clang of metal, sounded like an ending. She paused at the door, turned one last time. The med tent was gone now, packed away, erased, like it had never existed. But she knew better. Its memory lived in her hands, in the small scars, in the way she now hesitated before touching anything clean. As the chopper lifted off, the valley grew smaller beneath her. The hills, the wreckage, the ghosts, all fading into the dust. But the memories didn't fade. They never would. 2 weeks later. The city felt alien, streets too bright, people too clean, conversations too loud. Harper sat in the back of a military vehicle, staring out at the skyline she used to dream about. Now it just looked fragile. They'd given her clean clothes, a hot meal, and a room with white walls. She couldn't sleep in it. The silence was too empty. No wind, no hum of generators, no faint moans of the wounded in the dark. Just nothing. She found herself at the hospital base instead, volunteering. She said she couldn't stay away. She didn't say why. There, surrounded by stretchers and whispers, she finally felt something close to normal. Until one afternoon, A senior officer walked in with a group of reporters trailing behind. They called her name. "Sergeant Harper." She turned. The colonel stood there again, cleaner now but the same steel in his eyes. He was flanked by officials, cameras, the weight of ceremony. "We're here to honor your actions," he said. "The Commendation Board reviewed your case. You've been awarded the Cross of Valor." The reporters clicked and murmured. Someone held out the medal. But she didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the colonel's. "Sir," she said softly, "with respect, I can't take it." He frowned. "Why not?" "Because medals are for heroes," she said, "and all I did was what anyone should have done." The room went still. She reached into her pocket and placed the insignia, Corporal Hayes' insignia, on the table between them. "Give it to his family instead," she said. For a moment no one spoke. The colonel just looked at her, 1,000 words in his silence. Then he nodded once. "Understood." When the cameras turned away, he leaned close. "You remind me of why I joined in the first place," he said quietly. "Don't lose that." She smiled faintly. "I already did out there, but maybe that's okay." He left her then, and she stood there alone, metal box still open, empty. The light from the window caught the edges of her face, tired, scarred, but unbroken. That night she walked to the hospital roof. The city stretched below, alive and unaware. She breathed in the air, heavy with rain. For a moment she imagined she could still hear the hum of the med tent, the faint rhythm of heart monitors, the whispers of the soldiers who'd once filled the night with prayers and pain. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We made it." And somewhere deep inside, she hoped they heard her. Because in the end, this wasn't a story about war. It was about the quiet kind of courage, the kind no one sees, the kind that doesn't shout or march or fire, the kind that bleeds quietly and keeps going. And when dawn came, she stood there, a silhouette against the rising light, a medic who had seen hell and somehow carried a piece of grace back with her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.